Hello, my name is Dan Thornton from D.L. Thornton Economics. The purpose of this video is to explain why there's necessarily a negative relationship between bond prices and interest rates. That is, as interest rates go down, bond prices go up. As interest rates go up, bond prices go down. The way to understand this is to think about, well, you want to borrow money. So what do you want to do? You're demanding credit, right? And generally speaking, for most people, the demand for credit is going to be negatively related to the interest rate. That is, the lower the interest rate, the more money you want to borrow, the more credit you're going to demand. And so what will happen is the credit demand curve will be downward sloping in the interest rate. That is, the lower the interest rate, the larger the quantity credit that you demand. But if you're demanding credit, you're necessarily, of course, supplying bonds, IOUs. And the amount of bonds that you supply, the amount of IOUs you supply, will be upward sloping of the bond price. The higher the bond price, the more bonds you're going to be willing to supply, the more IOUs you're going to be willing to supply. Conversely, the people who are making the loans, they're supplying credit. And the higher the interest rate, the more credit they're going to want to supply. So the supply curve is upward sloping in the credit market. But if they're supplying credit, they're demanding bonds. And what's going to happen is the lower the price of the bond, the more bonds they're going to supply. So these things are reflected in the credit market equilibrium that I'm showing you and the bond market equilibrium. So where the supply and demand for credit intersect, that's the equilibrium interest rate. And where the supply and demand for bonds intersect, that's the equilibrium bond price. Now let's consider an example where all of a sudden people want to borrow more. They want more credit. So at every possible interest rate, they want to borrow more. So what happens is the demand for credit is going to shift to the right. Right? As that happens, the equilibrium price of credit, of course, the interest rate, is going to rise. But if you're demanding more credit, of course, you're doing what? You're simultaneously, of necessity, supplying more bonds. So in the bond market, what happens is the supply of bonds is going to also shift to the right. As the supply of bonds shift to the right, of course, the price of bonds, the equilibrium price of bonds, is going to fall. So if you increase the demand for credit, which is the same thing as increasing the supply of bonds, in the credit market, it means the interest rate's going up. In the bond market, it means the price of bonds are going to fall. Conversely, if there was an increase of supply of credit in the credit market, let's say everybody wants to lend more, so at every possible interest rate, the supply of credit is bigger, so the supply of credit shifts to the right. The equilibrium interest rate falls, but increasing the supply of credit is the same thing as increasing the demand for bonds. And so as the demand for bonds increases in the bond market, the equilibrium price of bonds is going to rise. Hence, there's a negative relationship between bond prices and interest rates. It's all due to the fact that when you borrow money, that is, when you demand credit, you're supplying bonds. And when you're supplying credit, you're demanding bonds. There's simply two ways of looking at exactly the same thing. I hope this simple explanation helps. You can find more of my research by going to dlthornton.com and clicking on the Services tab, which will link you to recent writings I've done on economic issues. You can also click on my Student Teacher tab, which will link you to essays I wrote when I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis on a variety of topics, and they're all listed by categories. Thank you.